what we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights.
Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Kriti Mehta and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from around the world. Now, as Western governments continue to champion human rights as a foundation of the rules-based order, global data is telling a different story. Political freedoms are declining, authoritarianism is rising, and strategic aliens and allies are often exempt from consequences. From West Asia to China, geopolitics appears to increasingly overrule universal norms. Joining us today for this discussion is Kenneth Roth, who is one of the world's most prominent human rights voices. He served for nearly 3 decades as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch and is now a visiting professor at Princeton University. Thank you for joining us here on Focal Length.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Roth, let's begin with the first question then. Since the end of the Cold War, Western governments have framed human rights as central to the international order, yet global freedoms continue to decline. Has human rights enforcement entered a phase of managed decline rather than principled defense in your perspective?
Well, I think this is certainly a challenging period for human rights. I think we should recognize that most pressure for human rights comes from within the country. We see this in Iran, where protesters are taking to the street trying to achieve democracy in their country. They've been killed by the thousands, but clearly the principal pressure for human rights is domestic. Now, what you point out is that the international community is inconsistent in its defense of human rights. That has always been the case. I mean, you talk about the principal defense of human rights. I wish that was so. What we've seen instead is selective defense. And these days, the US government under Trump is largely outside of defending human rights. Every once in a while, he's concerned about something, but mostly he's not. The European Union has been, much less aggressive than it used to be. So we are seeing a decline in global support for human rights, but the popular demand for human rights is still very much there.
Right. Mr. Roth, now with sustained military aid to Israel alongside settlement expansion and recurring civilian casualties in Gaza, at what point does Western backing cross from alliance into complicity under international law?
Oh, it's already at complicity. I think it's safe to say that the US government in particular, which gives $3.8 billion in military aid every year to Israel, it is aiding and abetting the genocide in Gaza, the apartheid in the West Bank, and the war crimes that we've seen committed in both places. The war crimes of indiscriminately bombing Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the war crime of settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank. So we are, way past just, ordinary complicity. We're into criminal aiding and abetting. That much is clear.
Right, and as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, it continues mass executions and repression while remaining a key Western arms buyer and energy partner. What does this really reveal about true limits of Western red lines?
Well, I mean, you're asking me about Saudi Arabia, but I would include in that question the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
They both are very similarly situated. Each is a monarchical dictatorship. Each tolerates no dissent whatsoever. Each has been involved in war crimes abroad. The Saudis in bombing civilians in Yemen, the Emiratis most recently in arming the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary in Sudan as it was committing genocide. And in each of these cases, there may be quiet representations to them by Western governments, but because they're both rich, because they have a lot of money to spend, there's been very little public pressure on them to stop, either their domestic repression or their external support for very abusive actors, as in Sudan.
Right. And despite the mass detentions and political repression that we are seeing in Egypt, it remains a major recipient of Western support. Has stability really replaced democratic legitimacy as the West's primary concern, Mr. Roth?
I mean, Egypt is a good example of the utter hypocrisy when it comes to Western support for human rights sometimes. And so, the government of then General, now President Sisi, we have to remember, he launched a coup against a democratically elected president, the first democratically elected president Egypt ever had, Mohamed Morsi. And in the course of committing that coup, they killed more than 800 people in the course of basically 12 hours in crushing a sit-in and stopping protests against the military government. Since then, there's been large-scale political imprisonment, systematic torture, but Western governments, the U.S. continues to send $1.3 billion in annual assistance to Egypt, and they basically ignore Egypt's repression because it's seen as a source of stability in the region, and because President Sisi promises to help Europeans curtail migration to Europe. So it's a very cynical calculation that essentially sees Western governments closing their eyes to what has been by far the most repressive government in Egypt's modern history.
Let's also then talk about Turkey, Mr. Roth. Turkey, of course, remains a NATO ally despite democratic backsliding and media repression. It's also now joined the Board of Peace. Does alliance membership now shield governments from accountability rather than reinforce democratic norms?
Turkey has very much benefited from its strategic location. To put this in perspective, President Erdogan, for the first time, is facing a very serious challenge. The mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, according to the polls, would have won the next presidential election. He's much more popular than Erdogan. So what Erdogan did was to concoct various criminal charges and threw him in prison. He basically got rid of the political opposition. And do we hear large-scale protests against this? No, because Turkey is seen as very important in helping Ukraine fend off Russia's invasion. It's seen as playing an important role in Syria, even though it's a very mixed role. And of course, Erdogan has also cooperated in stemming the flow of migrants to Europe. All of this has added up to basically immunity for the Erdogan government from serious pressure against its very severely diminishing human rights record.
All right, now on to China. We've all heard about allegations of human rights abuses there, and they're also widely documented, yet global responses are limited. Is economic dependence also then constraining accountability and weakening international norms?
Well, in the case of China's pervasive use of forced labor on the part of the Uyghurs, the United States did something decent under the Biden administration. It adopted legislation called the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which created a presumption against any imports from Xinjiang, the northwestern province of China, where most of the Uyghurs live. And that was very effective because it largely cut off the product of Uyghur forced labor coming to the United States. Sadly, Europe has not been as effective. Europe has a policy saying, oh, we're against forced labor, but they don't have this presumption against imports from Xinjiang. And because China keeps its supply chain secret, if you ask Europe, why are you letting in all this cotton? Or why are you letting all this polysilicon? Despite the extensive use of forced labor in these industries, they say, oh, well, we don't have any evidence that forced labor was used in this case. But you never have direct evidence because China covers it up. And Europe has refused to adopt a similar presumption as the United States. So as a result, imports from Xinjiang are increasing while they've plummeted in the United States.
Right, and Mr. Roth, now human rights also appear least enforceable in some of the democratically valuable states. If universality collapses under strategic pressure, what do you think, what future does international human rights law have?
Well, I think we have to recognize that international human rights law reflects people's very natural aspirations. I've traveled all over the world. I've never met somebody who wants to be summarily executed, who wants to be tortured or arbitrarily detained or denied housing or health care or employment. So these are universal aspirations. But what we've discussed here is that other governments' willingness to uphold those rights depends on other geopolitical factors. And frankly, India is a big beneficiary of that. Under the Modi government, India has quite systematically tolerated violence and discrimination against the very large Muslim population. But because India is seen as an important market, it's seen as a counter to China, it gets away with this with very little pressure. So, this is another failing of the international system. And I think it's important to press for much more consistent upholding of human rights standards, even when the repressive government is economically or geopolitically valuable.
Right. Thank you then, Mr. Kenneth Roth, for joining me and for sharing your insights on Focal Length here at NewsX World.
Thank you so much for having me.
And viewers, with that, it's a wrap on this episode of Focal Length. For more international news and updates, stay tuned to NewsX World.